Have you ever been lied on, betrayed, or attacked for no reason at all? That's exactly where David found himself in Psalm chapter 35. But instead of fighting back in his own strength, he cried out for God to be his defender. This psalm is not just David's prayer, it's your battle strategy when life feels unfair. Psalm chapter 35 verse 1. Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. David is facing opposition from people who are striving, arguing, attacking, or contending against him. Instead of taking matters into his own hands, he appeals to God as the divine advocate, plead my cause, and divine warrior, fight against them. The language echoes both a courtroom, where a lawyer pleads a case, and a battlefield, where a soldier fights. David is declaring his dependence on God to be both his defender and protector. When people falsely accuse you or oppose you, you don't have to fight every battle in your own strength. God can be both your lawyer and your soldier. This verse reminds believers to bring struggles directly to God instead of retaliating in anger. Spiritually, it also points to the reality of unseen warfare. Satan and his forces strive against the people of God, but the Lord himself fights for his children. Exodus chapter 14 verse 14, Romans chapter 8 verse 31. In what area of your life right now do you need God to plead your cause and fight your battle? Psalm chapter 35 verse 2. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help. David shifts from legal imagery, verses 1, to military imagery. A shield was the large protective guard, while a buckler was a smaller, maneuverable shield used in closer combat. By calling on God to take hold of these, David pictures the Lord as a fully armed warrior rising to defend him. The phrase, stand up for mine help, implies urgency. David is asking God to rise and take an active, visible role in his defense. God doesn't just watch from a distance, he actively arms himself to defend his people. Sometimes we need both the large shield, covering protection in overwhelming attacks, and the small buckler, close, personal defense in intimate battles of the heart and mind. This verse encourages us to pray boldly for God's intervention, not just in vague ways but with specific images of his protection. Spiritually, this points us to Christ, who is our ultimate shield of faith, Ephesians chapter 6 verse 16, and our very present help in trouble, Psalm chapter 46 verse 1. Psalm chapter 35 verse 3. Draw out also the spear, and stop the way against them that persecute me. Say unto my soul, I am thy salvation. David adds another weapon to the imagery, the spear, used for offense rather than defense. He's asking God not only to protect him but also to intervene directly against those who pursue him. The phrase, stop the way, means to block or cut off the path of his persecutors, halting their progress. But David's request doesn't stop with external victory. He longs to hear God's voice personally. Say unto my soul, I am thy salvation. In other words, he seeks not just outward deliverance from enemies but inward assurance of God's saving presence. God fights both outside battles, against opposition, and inside battles, fear, anxiety, doubt. Sometimes what we need most isn't just rescue from the problem but the assurance of God's presence in the middle of it. This verse reminds us to pray not only for God to stop the plans of the enemy but also to speak peace to our souls. Jesus fulfills this cry. He is our salvation, Matthew chapter 1 verse 21. John chapter 10 verse 28. And his Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, Romans chapter 8 verse 16. Which do you need most right now? God's intervention against opposition, or his whisper of assurance to your soul? Where do you need God to stand up and actively shield you today, against outside attacks or inward battles? Psalm chapter 35 verse 4. Let them be confounded and put to shame that seek after my soul. Let them be turned back and brought to confusion that devise my hurt. David now prays directly against the plans of his enemies. He asks that those seeking to harm him would be confounded, frustrated, caught off guard, put to shame, exposed, dishonored, turned back, forced to retreat, brought to confusion. Their plots unravel into disorder. There will always be people or forces that devise hurt against God's children. Instead of fighting them in our own strength, we can ask the Lord to frustrate their plans. God has a way of making the strategies of the enemy backfire. See Haman in Esther chapter 7 verse 10. For us today, this verse teaches us to entrust opposition, false accusations, or spiritual attacks into God's hands. Pray that he will expose lies and protect your life's purpose. Spiritually, This is also a picture of Christ's victory. On the cross, Satan's schemes were turned back and confounded. Colossians chapter 2 verse 15. Psalm chapter 35 verse 5. Let them be as chaff before the wind, and let the angel of the Lord chase them. David uses a powerful agricultural image. Chaff is the lightweight husk separated from wheat during threshing. When the wind blows, it scatters the chaff easily because it has no weight or substance. David prays that his enemies would become like this, unstable, powerless, and quickly carried away. He also calls on the angel of the Lord to chase them. This reflects God's active intervention. In the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord often represents God's immediate and powerful presence, sometimes bringing judgment. Exodus chapter 14 verse 19. 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35. Enemies of God's people may look strong, but in reality they are like chaff, empty and temporary. Only those rooted in God, like the tree in Psalm chapter 1, have lasting strength. God is not passive. His angelic armies move on behalf of his children. Psalm chapter 34 verse 7. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 14. In your struggles, remember, those who oppose God's purposes cannot stand. He can scatter them like dust in the wind. Spiritually, this points forward to Christ's victory, where evil is defeated and powerless against God's kingdom. Are you trusting in God to scatter the chaff, false accusations, fears, or attacks in your life? Or are you still trying to fight the wind yourself? Psalm chapter 35 verse 6. Let their way be dark and slippery, and let the angel of the Lord persecute them. David adds another vivid image. He prays that the path of his enemies would be like a road that is dark and slippery, dangerous, uncertain, and impossible to travel safely. Darkness symbolizes confusion and judgment, while slipperiness suggests sudden falls. Once again, he calls on the angel of the Lord to act, not just chasing, verses 5, but now persecuting them, pressing them until they collapse under God's judgment. This emphasizes that those who plot evil against God's people will face divine resistance every step of the way. When you walk in God's light, your path is clear. Psalm chapter 119 verse 105. But those who oppose God stumble in darkness. John chapter 11 verse 10. Sometimes you may feel like your enemies are advancing, but remember, their path is unstable and unsustainable. God's presence surrounds you like an army. He not only defends you but actively hinders those who scheme against you. Spiritually, this foreshadows the eternal destiny of the wicked. The way of the ungodly shall perish. Psalm chapter 1 verse 6. Do you believe God is already at work making the enemy's path dark and slippery, while keeping your steps firm? Psalm chapter 35 verse 7. For without cause have they hid for me their net in a pit, which without cause they have digged for my soul. David explains why he is asking for God's intervention. His enemies are acting without cause, they have no just reason for their hostility. The imagery he uses is that of a hunter or trapper. Net in a pit, a hidden snare, covered over, waiting for someone to fall in. Digged for my soul, they are not just trying to harm his body, but to destroy his life and spirit. This verse highlights the injustice of the attack. David had done nothing to deserve it, yet his enemies were secretly plotting his downfall. Sometimes we face opposition or slander without reason. People may scheme, lie, or dig traps with no cause. When that happens, take comfort. God sees the injustice even if no one else does. This verse reminds us of Jesus, who was also hated, without a cause. John chapter 15 verse 25. When we are wronged unfairly, we share in his sufferings. Instead of falling into fear, trust that the Lord can expose every hidden trap and protect your soul from unseen snare. Have you ever faced harm or opposition you didn't deserve? How can remembering Jesus' own unjust suffering help you endure it with faith? Psalm chapter 35 verse 8. Let destruction come upon him at unawares, and let his net that he hath hid catch himself. Into that very destruction let him fall. David prays that his enemies' plans would backfire. The very net they secretly set for him should trap them instead. The destruction they designed for David should unexpectedly fall on their own heads. This is a theme throughout Scripture. Evil often boomerangs. Haman built gallows for Mordecai but was hanged on them himself. Esther chapter 7 verse 10. Daniel's accusers were thrown into the lion's den they plotted for him. Daniel chapter 6 verse 24. The cross itself looked like victory for Satan, but it became the instrument of his defeat. Colossians chapter 2 verse 15. God can turn the schemes of the enemy against themselves. What looks like the end for you may become the downfall of your adversary. When wronged, you don't need to plot revenge. Instead, pray like David, that God will let evil plans collapse under their own weight. This verse encourages patience. Sometimes God allows wicked plans to mature, only to reverse them in His perfect timing. Are you willing to let God handle your enemies in His way and timing, trusting that He can cause their own nets to catch them? Psalm chapter 35 verse 9. And my soul shall be joyful in the Lord, it shall rejoice in His salvation. After praying that his enemies' traps would catch themselves, verses 8, David shifts focus from destruction to deliverance. He expresses confidence that God will answer, and already anticipates rejoicing. Notice two important points. His joy is in the Lord, not in the downfall of enemies, but in God Himself. His rejoicing is in God's salvation, the rescue, deliverance, and safety only God can provide. This verse marks a turning point from desperation to faith-filled praise. True joy isn't based on circumstances but on the Lord. Even before deliverance comes, you can rejoice by faith in His salvation. Don't rejoice when enemies stumble. Proverbs chapter 24 verse 17. Instead, rejoice in the God who saves. For believers, this points us to Jesus, our eternal salvation. Acts chapter 4 verse 12. Our ultimate joy rests not in temporary victories but in the cross and resurrection. Do you find your joy in God Himself, or in the downfall of those who wrong you? How can you shift your focus to rejoicing in His salvation alone? Psalm chapter 35 verse 10. All my bones shall say, Lord, who is like unto Thee, which deliverest the poor from him that is too strong for him, yea, the poor and the needy from him that spoileth him. David continues his praise, moving from his soul, verses 9, to his whole body, all my bones shall say. This is a Hebrew way of expressing total involvement. Every part of him will declare God's greatness. He marvels at God's unique power. Who is like unto Thee? God defends the poor, weak, and needy when they are helpless against enemies, too strong for them. The verse paints God as the champion of the vulnerable, stepping in where human strength is insufficient. When you feel weak and overpowered, remember, God delights to deliver the poor and needy. Your insufficiency is the very stage for His strength. This verse teaches humility. We are all spiritually poor and needy without God's salvation. It also points to Jesus, who declared in Luke chapter 4 verse 18 that He was sent to bring good news to the poor and liberty to the oppressed. Let your worship engage not just your lips but your whole being, body, mind, and spirit. When was the last time you praised God with your whole being, not just with words? How can you practice wholehearted worship in your daily life? Psalm chapter 35 verse 11. False witnesses did rise up, they laid to my charge things that I knew not. Here David shifts back from praise, VV.9 to 10, to describing his suffering. He recalls how false witnesses rose against him, accusing him of things he never did or even knew about. The phrase, things that I knew not, emphasizes the absurdity and injustice of the charges, pure fabrication. This verse reflects the pain of slander and false accusation. In David's case, this could have been political opponents, enemies at court, or even former friends turning against him. Ultimately, this also points to Jesus, who was surrounded by false witnesses at His trial. Matthew chapter 26 verses 59 to 60. Being falsely accused is one of the most painful experiences. It attacks both reputation and soul. But God sees truth even when people lie. Instead of trying to fight every false word, follow David's example. Bring it to the Lord. Remember that if Jesus endured false witnesses, we should not be surprised when people misrepresent us. Sharing in His sufferings prepares us to share in His glory. How do you normally respond when someone misrepresents you? Do you defend yourself at all costs, or do you trust God to vindicate you in His time? Psalm chapter 35 verse 12. They rewarded me evil for good to the spoiling of my soul. David describes the injustice deeper. Instead of gratitude for his kindness, his enemies gave him evil in return for good. This, spoiling of my soul, suggests deep inner pain, as if his very life was being robbed. Betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from those you've helped. This verse mirrors a theme throughout Scripture. Joseph's brothers repaid his goodness with slavery, Genesis chapter 37. Jesus healed, loved, and taught, yet was crucified by the very people He blessed. When people repay your good with evil, you are walking in the footsteps of God's servants, and of Christ Himself. Don't let betrayal harden your heart. Continue doing good, knowing your reward comes from the Lord. Galatians chapter 6 verse 9. The world's response may spoil your soul if you let bitterness take root. But when you bring the hurt to God, He restores peace and guards your heart. Has someone ever repaid your kindness with betrayal? How can you keep your soul from becoming spoiled by bitterness in those moments? Psalm chapter 35 verse 13. But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled my soul with fasting, and my prayer returned into mine own bosom. David contrasts his enemies' evil with his own compassion. When they were sick, instead of gloating, he mourned for them, putting on sackcloth, a sign of grief and humility, and fasting. He humbled himself before God on their behalf. The phrase, "my prayer returned into mine own bosom," can mean two things. His prayers for them were genuine and heartfelt, flowing from his own heart. Or, his prayers seemed unanswered, returning back to himself, yet he still prayed. Either way, David highlights the sincerity of his intercession, even for those who later turned against him. True godliness shows compassion even toward those who don't return it. Praying for others, especially enemies, reflects the heart of Christ. Luke chapter 23 verse 34. Fasting and prayer not only move God's hand but also shape our hearts, keeping us humble instead of bitter. Sometimes prayers for others may feel like they return to your bosom, but God still uses them to transform you. Am I willing to pray sincerely, even sacrificially, for those who might later mistreat me? Psalm chapter 35 verse 14. I behaved myself as though he had been my friend or brother. I bowed down heavily, as one that mourneth for his mother. David describes the depth of his compassion. When his enemies were in trouble, he treated them not like rivals, but like friends or brothers. He entered into their pain so deeply that he mourned for them as one would grieve for a mother's death, one of the most profound forms of sorrow. This highlights the contrast. David showed loyalty, love, and empathy, yet those same people betrayed and slandered him. VV.11-12. His kindness was met with cruelty. God calls us to love even those who mistreat us. David foreshadows Jesus, who wept over Jerusalem even though the city rejected him. Luke chapter 19 verse 41. True compassion is costly. It means entering into another's grief as if it were your own. When your love and loyalty are not reciprocated, take comfort. God sees your faithfulness, and He will reward what others overlook. Have you ever grieved for someone, prayed, cared, or wept for them, only for them to turn against you? How can Christ's example strengthen you to keep showing love anyway? Psalm chapter 35 verse 15. But in mine adversity they rejoiced, and gathered themselves together. Yea, the abjects gathered themselves together against me, and I knew it not. They did tear me, and ceased not. David describes the betrayal more vividly. While he showed compassion in their sickness, VV.13-14, they rejoiced in his adversity. They gathered themselves together. Enemies often unite when God's servant stumbles. The word, abjects, likely refers to vile, low people, mockers or outcasts, who joined the chorus of scorn. I knew it not suggests that even strangers, people David didn't know, joined in. They did tear me, and ceased not, conveys relentless verbal attack, as if they were ripping him apart with words. This is the cruelty of mockery. Many take pleasure in the downfall of the righteous. Betrayal often multiplies in times of adversity. People who once were silent may suddenly gather to mock. Words can wound deeply. They did tear me, reminds us of how slander and gossip can cut like knives. Yet, the believer can take comfort. Christ endured the same when crowds mocked him at the cross. Matthew chapter 27 verses 39-44. Our calling is not to repay mockery but to keep entrusting ourselves to the righteous judge. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 23. When others mock or rejoice at your struggles, do you become bitter, or do you follow Christ's example of entrusting your pain to God? Psalm chapter 35 verse 16. With hypocritical mockers in feasts, they gnashed upon me with their teeth. David paints a picture of his enemies' cruelty. Hypocritical mockers in feasts. These were people who mocked while pretending to celebrate. It suggests false friends who laughed at his pain behind the mask of fellowship. Their feasting was not in joy but in scorn. They gnashed upon me with their teeth, a vivid image of rage and hatred. In Scripture, gnashing of teeth expresses violent anger or malicious hostility. See Acts chapter 7 verse 54. In other words, their laughter was not harmless teasing, it was dripping with venom and hatred. Some of the deepest wounds come not from open enemies, but from hypocrites who act friendly in public but secretly despise you. Mockery is a tool of the enemy. It aims to crush your spirit through ridicule. But God sees through the mask of hypocrisy. Jesus also endured hypocritical mockery during his trial and crucifixion. The soldiers laughed, crowned him with thorns, and mocked his kingship. Matthew chapter 27 verse 29. When we face mockery, we walk in his footsteps. Have you ever faced mockery disguised as friendship? How can you respond in a Christ-like way, refusing bitterness but entrusting yourself to God's justice? Psalm chapter 35 verse 17. Lord, how long wilt thou look on? Rescue my soul from their destructions, my darling from the lions. David, weary of mockery and attacks, now cries out with urgency, how long wilt thou look on? This is the prayer of the suffering believer who feels God's silence. David wonders why God seems to watch but not yet act. Rescue my soul from their destructions. He pleads for deliverance from the plots that aim to ruin him. My darling from the lions, the word, darling, means my precious life or my only life. David pictures himself surrounded by lions, powerful, hungry, and ready to devour. This verse reveals David's desperation. He feels vulnerable, almost consumed, and begs God to intervene before it's too late. Believers often pray the same words, Lord, how long? God's timing may feel delayed, but he never ignores the cries of his children. When you feel surrounded by lions, overwhelming troubles, people, or spiritual attacks, remember, your life is precious to God. He guards what is his. Christ himself prayed similarly in Gethsemane and on the cross, asking why the Father seemed far. Matthew chapter 26 verse 39, 27 to 46. In those moments, he identified fully with our suffering. Do you trust that your life, your darling, is precious to God, even when he seems silent? Psalm chapter 35 verse 18. I will give thee thanks in the great congregation. I will praise thee among much people. David makes a vow of public thanksgiving. He promises that when God delivers him, he will not keep the gratitude private but declare it openly. The great congregation likely refers to a large public assembly, such as a feast day or national gathering. Among much people, David envisions his testimony of God's deliverance inspiring many. This verse highlights the principle of praise following deliverance. God rescues us not only for our benefit but also for his glory before others. When God answers your prayers, share it. Public praise strengthens faith in the community and testifies to God's power. Don't just thank God quietly. Let your testimony encourage others who may be waiting for their own deliverance. For believers today, this points to our witness. Every answered prayer is an opportunity to glorify Jesus before others. Luke chapter 17 verses 15 to 18. When God delivers you, do you keep it private, or do you openly give him thanks, among much people? Psalm chapter 35 verse 19. Let not them that are mine enemies wrongfully rejoice over me. Neither let them wink with the eye that hate me without a cause. David asks God to prevent his enemies from gloating. Enemies wrongfully rejoice. They were celebrating his troubles even though he had done nothing to deserve their hatred. Wink with the eye. In ancient usage, winking wasn't playful. It was a sign of malicious mockery or secret plotting. See Proverbs chapter 6 verse 13. Without a cause, repeated earlier, verses 7. This underscores the injustice. Their hatred was baseless. This verse highlights the deep sting of unjust hatred, being despised not for wrongdoing but simply for who you are or because of God's calling on your life. Not all opposition in your life will be logical. Some hatred comes without a cause. When people mock your struggles or rejoice in your pain, God sees and will not let their laughter have the last word. Jesus fulfilled this verse. He was hated without a cause. John chapter 15 verse 25. When we face baseless hostility, we share in his sufferings. Have you ever been disliked or opposed without a cause? How can remembering Jesus' own unjust rejection strengthen you to endure it? Psalm chapter 35 verse 20. For they speak not peace, but they devise deceitful matters against them that are quiet in the land. David exposes the heart of his enemies. They speak not peace. Their words are never aimed at reconciliation or truth. Instead of calming tensions, they stir up strife. They devise deceitful matters. Their plans are rooted in lies, crafted to harm. Against them that are quiet in the land, their targets are not rebels or troublemakers, but the innocent and peaceable, those simply trying to live quietly under God's law. This verse shows the wickedness of slanderers. They attack the defenseless, using lies instead of truth. Some people thrive on conflict and deception, they cannot speak peace. Don't be surprised if they oppose you even when you seek to live quietly. God calls his children to be the opposite, to seek peace and pursue it. Psalm chapter 34 verse 14. Romans chapter 12 verse 18. Spiritually, this reminds us of the enemy of our souls. Satan is the father of lies, John chapter 8 verse 44, always devising deceit against God's people. But Christ, the Prince of Peace, speaks truth and brings lasting peace. Am I more often a speaker of peace or a carrier of conflict? Do my words reflect the Prince of Peace or the deviser of deceit? Psalm chapter 35 verse 21. Yea, they opened their mouth wide against me, and said, Aha, aha, our eye hath seen it. David describes the boldness of his enemies. Opened their mouth wide, a picture of shameless mockery and slander. Their words are loud, exaggerated, and destructive. Aha, aha, an expression of triumph, ridicule, or gloating, as though they finally caught him guilty. Our eye hath seen it. They claimed to have evidence against him, but it was false. They delighted in twisting things to his shame. This verse shows the cruelty of those who rejoice in false accusations. It echoes how Christ's enemies mocked him on the cross, saying, he trusted in God. Let him deliver him now. Matthew chapter 27 verse 43. People may falsely claim to have seen something in you that justifies their hate. Don't despair. God knows the truth. Mockery often comes when you are most vulnerable. The enemy loves to magnify lies to make you question yourself. Jesus endured the same ridicule, so when you face it, you are sharing in his sufferings, and you will also share in his vindication. How do you respond when others exaggerate, mock, or twist your actions? Do you let their false eyes define you, or do you rest in God's true vision of who you are? Psalm chapter 35 verse 22. This thou hast seen, O Lord. Keep not silence. O Lord, be not far from me. David shifts his focus back to God. After describing how his enemies falsely accused him, verses 21, he reminds himself of an important truth. God sees. This thou hast seen, O Lord. While enemies claim to see evidence against David, he declares that God's vision is the only one that matters. God sees both the injustice and his innocence. Keep not silence. David longs for God to speak, to act, and to vindicate him openly. Silence from God in the middle of trial feels unbearable. Be not far from me. This is a prayer for God's nearness. Even if deliverance has not yet come, David longs for the comfort of his presence. Others may twist your story, but God sees the whole truth. Rest in his knowledge of your situation. When God seems silent, keep crying out. Silence is not absence, he is still working. Sometimes the greatest deliverance isn't immediate rescue, but the assurance of his nearness. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart. Psalm chapter 34 verse 18. When you feel falsely judged, do you focus more on what people see, or on the truth that God sees everything clearly? Psalm chapter 35 verse 23. Stir up thyself, and awake to my judgment, even unto my cause, my God and my Lord. David pleads for God to rise up and act. Stir up thyself, as though David feels God has been still or inactive, he asks him to move with power. Awake to my judgment, not that God is asleep, but David longs for him to bring justice and declare his innocence. Even unto my cause, David is entrusting his personal case to the Lord, as a petitioner before the judge of all the earth. My God and my Lord, this double title shows intimacy and reverence. God is both David's personal covenant God, my God, and his sovereign master, my Lord. When life feels unfair, pray boldly. Ask God to stir up and act. Honest cries like David's are not irreverence but faith in God's justice. The world's courts may fail you, but the heavenly judge will not. He knows your cause. This verse reminds us that prayer is not just ritual, it's calling on God to intervene in real cases of injustice. For the believer, Jesus is our advocate before the Father, 1 John chapter 2 verse 1. He pleads our cause better than we ever could. When you feel wronged, do you take your case to God as judge, or do you rely only on defending yourself before people? Psalm chapter 35 verse 24. Judge me, O Lord my God, according to thy righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. David appeals for God's judgment, but notice the basis. According to thy righteousness, David doesn't claim perfection or self-righteousness. Instead, he asks to be judged by God's perfect justice and fairness. He is confident that before God's eyes, the accusations against him will not stand. Let them not rejoice over me. His plea is that the enemies would not be allowed to gloat or celebrate over his downfall. This is not just a personal desire for vindication but a defense of God's honor. If the wicked rejoice over the righteous, it reflects poorly on God's covenant faithfulness. When falsely accused or misunderstood, you can appeal to God's righteous judgment. Unlike human opinions, his verdict is flawless. We do not stand on our own righteousness but on Christ's righteousness credited to us. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 21. God will not allow your enemies to have the last laugh. His justice ensures that the truth will prevail. Am I trusting in my own defense when wronged, or am I resting in God's righteousness to vindicate me? Psalm chapter 35 verse 25. Let them not say in their hearts, "Ah, so would we have it." Let them not say, "We have swallowed him up." David continues his plea, focusing on the inner thoughts and outward words of his enemies. Let them not say in their hearts, "Ah, so would we have it." He prays that God will not allow them to feel inward triumph, as though their schemes had succeeded. Let them not say, "We have swallowed him up." This is imagery of complete destruction, like a predator devouring its prey. David asks that his enemies would not be given the satisfaction of believing they had utterly overcome him. In essence, David is praying that the plans and desires of the wicked would not reach fulfillment. The enemy of your soul wants to swallow up your testimony, your peace, and your faith. But God will not allow Satan or human adversaries to have the last word. This verse encourages us to pray specifically against the satisfaction of the wicked, that God would frustrate their joy in evil. Spiritually, this reminds us of Christ's victory. The cross looked like defeat to his enemies, but God overturned their triumph into resurrection glory. Do you believe God can frustrate the plans of your enemies so completely that they won't even be able to boast about your downfall? Psalm chapter 35 verse 26. Let them be ashamed and brought to confusion together that rejoice at mine hurt. Let them be clothed with shame and dishonor that magnify themselves against me. David prays that his enemies' arrogance would be turned against them, ashamed and brought to confusion together. He asks God to strip away their confidence and expose their plots as empty and foolish. That rejoice at mine hurt. These enemies delighted in his pain, but David wants their rejoicing to turn into regret. Clothed with shame and dishonor. A striking image. Instead of wearing garments of pride and victory, they will be covered in disgrace and humiliation. This is divine reversal. The mockers who magnified themselves will be brought low before God. God sees those who rejoice at your struggles, and he will not let their arrogance stand. Those who magnify themselves against God's people ultimately magnify themselves against God, and he resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. James chapter 4 verse 6. Instead of seeking to shame others ourselves, we can pray like David, entrusting God to turn pride into dishonor and vindicate his children. Do I leave matters of justice in God's hands, or do I try to clothe my enemies with shame myself instead of letting God handle it? Psalm chapter 35 verse 27. Let them shout for joy and be glad, that favor my righteous cause. Yea, let them say continually, let the Lord be magnified, which hath pleasure in the prosperity of his servant. David turns from speaking of his enemies to blessing those who stand with him. Shout for joy, and be glad. A call for celebration among the faithful who support God's servant. That favor my righteous cause. These are not just David's personal supporters but those who stand with him because his cause aligns with God's justice. Let the Lord be magnified. The real focus of their praise is not David's victory but God's greatness. Which hath pleasure in the prosperity of his servant. A powerful reminder that God delights to bless and uphold his faithful ones. His heart is not indifferent but takes joy in his people's well-being. God's people should rejoice when righteousness is upheld, not only when evil is defeated. Our testimony should always turn praise back to God. Let the Lord be magnified. This verse also affirms God's fatherly heart. He takes pleasure in blessing his children. Your victories in him bring him joy. Spiritually, this foreshadows the church rejoicing in Christ's triumph, magnifying God for the salvation and prosperity he gives through Jesus. Do my victories lead others to magnify me, or do they inspire people to continually say, "Let the Lord be magnified"? Psalm chapter 35 verse 28. And my tongue shall speak of thy righteousness and of thy praise all the day long. David closes the psalm with a vow of lifelong gratitude. My tongue shall speak. He resolves that his words will not be consumed by complaint or retaliation, but by testimony and worship. Of thy righteousness, he will tell of God's perfect justice, which vindicates the innocent and humbles the proud. And of thy praise all the day along, his gratitude won't be occasional, but continual. Every part of the day will echo with thanksgiving. This ending shifts focus entirely from enemies back to God. The battle belongs to the Lord, and the praise belongs to him too. Make a commitment that your tongue will magnify God more than it magnifies problems. When God delivers you, don't forget to keep praising, not just once, but continually. Speaking of God's righteousness reminds others that he is faithful and just. Speaking of his praise keeps your heart from bitterness. As believers, our lives should echo David's vow to testify of Christ's saving work and continually praise him. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 15. If someone listened to your words throughout the day, would they hear more about your struggles, or about God's righteous? Feeling attacked or misunderstood? Psalm chapter 35 is God's battle cry for your defense. Subscribe to Living Word Media for more verse-by-verse encouragement and let the Word fight for you.